For EdPuzzle5, we are going to briefly go over your instructions for your peer reviews this week. So the good news is that you don't have to do any of your own writing this week. You've got all of your proposal done, and so we're going to focus on editing each other's papers this week. As was outlined in the syllabus, you guys have 2 peer reviews to complete. And so if you took the method sequence with me, some of this is going to be a review because we are peer reviewing these papers in much the same way that we reviewed the literature reviews in PSYC498 So the objective for the assignments this week and just this EdPuzzle in general is, first of all, I'm going to email you 2 of your peers' research proposals. They're going to be de-identified without names, but I'm going to send this directly to your Mercer email and not through Canvas message or through submission feedback or anything like that. Mercer email is the most reliable way to send over these files. After you get those, by Friday, you will have to review both of those research proposals and submit your reviews, which will include track changes and comments according to the instructions here. So you're just going to review the 2 papers that I email, and then you'll attach them to the submission folder in Canvas, and that's pretty much all you have to do this week in addition to this EdPuzzle. So why do we practice peer reviewing, especially since we already learned how to do the basics of it in the research method sequence? Well, we are tackling new content this session since we're learning how to think about and design an experiment. And so providing feedback, even though you guys have been doing it all along the way, now you'll be able to see a bigger picture, including the lit review and how all of these methods pieces fit together. And so you can help the author out since you're going to be the perfect reader for their research proposal. You don't have a whole lot of prior knowledge on the topic, perhaps maybe no prior knowledge on the topic, and that is really the audience that we write these papers for. We want a lay audience. We want to explain things to a normal person in a way that they can understand without having to have a whole lot of background knowledge. And so since you are coming to this paper with fresh eyes, it's really easier for you to point out holes in the clarity of the writing, the flow of the writing, and organization, which probably won't be as big of an aspect for this assignment. And you can also point out errors and typos that the author themselves reads right over since they've read their paper so many times. And you can also use your strengths as a writer and help them improve upon their paper for what you're really good at. And so all of us have different strengths when it comes to writing. You might be a real stickler for grammar. You might have a great vocabulary. You might be really good at the APA formatting nuances that come along with these assignments. And your strengths might be different than the author's. And so we all have different contributions that we can help make for each other. So it does help the author. You're literally going to be editing their paper and increasing their score by making it better and fixing errors in it. But it's also helpful for you as the reviewer. Taking the perspective as the reader and not an editor and not necessarily the writer, it's going to allow you later, when you go back and look at your own paper, to perhaps notice issues with clarity on your own paper that you didn't notice before. So practicing on other people's paper can translate actually to when you go edit your own paper. And then also one of the main objectives with this assignment and any peer review assignment is to get really familiar with track changes and comments. And so if you did this in the method sequence, you should be able to go a little bit quicker and be more familiar with using the Microsoft tools that we're going to be using to make these edits. I've had a lot of students tell me in job interviews and other work-related things that they've been expected to know how to do track changes and make comments, and have even been tested on that in interviews. This is a really important skill to have across any domain that you'll be working in later on. So I'm going to break this down into specific steps, but the first step before you even start looking at your peer-reviewed papers and reading through them is that we got to get in the right mindset. So you're going to kind of put a pretend situation here, and I find that this really helps to kind of establish how much you need to be editing in this paper and how much you need to be helping your peer. Really, you want to help them as much as possible. And so what's helpful is to kind of pretend or put yourself in the perspective that you are proofreading maybe your spouse's or one of your close friends, or even, you know, your older child's paper for school, and they've got to do really well on this paper to get an A in the class. If they, you know, get a B in this paper, it's not going to pull their average up high enough, and they're not going to be able to pass the class. And so you want to pretend that you're editing someone that's very close to you's paper. They've got a real stickler of a teacher, and you need to try to help them fix as many things as possible. We also want to keep in mind, as we're taking this perspective, that often we feel bad correcting things because essentially it's pointing out things that they haven't done quite right or that are even just wrong. And so this isn't necessarily picking on people. You don't need to feel bad that you end up making a lot of changes perhaps to a paper. Really, again, this is just corrections that you're making to their paper. It's going to improve their final score. Every typo error that you correct, grammatical error, content error, these are all things that are going to improve their score and make it so they don't have as many points taken off on the rubric. And so you're really just helping them. It's not picking at them. The better the reviewers are, the better their final paper is going to be. So you are literally doing things for them that they weren't able to do on their own. There's no writer that can produce a great paper without the help of peers. In the real world, especially when it comes to research, we have a lot of people peer review our papers for us before we submit them. And often you're collaborating on a paper. You guys see with all your articles that there's most often 2 to 6 authors on a paper. And so all of those people are doing this process on the same paper. And so this is normal and typical in most fields that we're doing, and especially in the social sciences. Another thing to keep in mind is that you are the audience for this paper. This paper should be written for someone like you that doesn't necessarily have a lot of background knowledge on the exact topic that they're proposing the study for. So if you don't understand something in this paper, that's an indication that that part of the paper needs to be edited or fixed or improved. Not that you might just not understand it because you don't know very much about this topic. You're not supposed to know much about this topic. You should be able to understand the paper without having a lot of expertise in it. So if you don't understand something, then that's indicative that something in the paper needs to be improved or changed. And so there's going to be times when you're editing these papers that you might be unsure of an edit that you're making or a suggestion that you're making to them. So if you're unsure of the accuracy of, say, a grammatical error that you're trying to change or a suggestion that you're making about content, go ahead and make it anyways. You are not going to be penalized for changing something incorrectly. I understand that we're all practicing this process and learning as we go. And so what I'm going to do is I filter through all of your comments and I combine them and compile them with my comments in a final version, revised version that I will send to everyone. And so if you make a comment that's maybe not a great comment or it's even inaccurate, a change that you made, I'll get rid of that and it won't end up in the author's hands, okay? So you just want to try your best. Of course, if you're unsure about something that you can simply look up online, like a grammatical change or a formatting change, you certainly should look it up online and figure out how to correct it accurately. But for other things that you might not be able to find an answer for online, like where to put the comma in a sentence or something, go ahead and make it anyways, and I'll make sure that only the really useful feedback gets to that author. So in these instructions, and these are the same as the instructions that I gave you in the method sequence, which is a few tweaks, but here I break this process down into 2 steps. So you read through the paper once and leave comments for clarity and organization, and then you read through the paper again and leave track changes to proofread it. If you're already familiar with using comments and using track changes and didn't have a problem with it in the method sequence or have done it a lot in other courses, then go ahead and just combine these steps into one, and you can leave comments and track changes at the same time as you read through the paper. If you're not really familiar with this process or using these tools in Word, then I encourage you to break it down into these 2 steps that I'm suggesting here. It doesn't make it take any longer to read through it twice and do the comments and track changes separately. Rather, it's just what you're most comfortable with. And so what are we going to be reviewing in these steps that I'm outlining? Again, I'm sending you 2 papers, but you're reviewing the papers in the entirety. You're not just reviewing the method sections that we've been working on in this course. You're going to review the paper from title page to the very last reference on the reference list. And so we're going to be doing the whole thing. So the first step, broad step, is to go through the paper and leave comments. And so these comments are going to be larger grained issues that you can't proofread and change yourself with track changes. So say there's a part that you don't understand or something else that you need to point out, maybe a problem with design. Those are things that you can point out in comments. And in your comment, for anything that you leave, you need to, 1, point out what the problem is or what you've noticed, and then you need to provide a suggestion for how to fix it. It's not entirely helpful to say, this isn't great, but it is helpful to say, this seems like the population you're recruiting is too small, perhaps double it and make it 200 to make sure you end up with enough people, okay? So each comment should be 2 parts, point out what's wrong, and then give them a suggestion for how to fix it. Again, if you're unsure for your suggestion, keep in mind that I'll filter through and make sure that only great suggestions end up with the author. So things that you might want to point out in comments are places where you get lost or confused and why. So is there a word that they haven't explained yet and you don't know what it is? Do they randomly switch terms between synonyms and you're confused by the vocabulary? Is the writing itself hard to comprehend? Perhaps they have really, really long sentences with a lot of commas and clauses. These are just broad things that you need to point out in a comment. You can also point out issues with the content. So places where content is missing, perhaps in their procedure, they don't mention debriefing at all, or you can indicate places where the content isn't needed. So perhaps they summarize and reiterate who the participants are in the procedure section. You can tell them they don't need that. Or again, places where the content is incoherent and you can't comprehend what's going on enough to really make a good suggestion. So again, you'd want to point these out in the comment. Tell them as specifically as you can what's confusing you or what needs to be improved upon, and then a suggestion why. So if you're going to break this into 2 steps, you can ignore the smaller grained issues with grammar, style, and mechanics. Those are things that in this next step, when we turn on the track changes, you can go back and actually fix yourself. If you're going to be doing comments and track changes all at the same time, then again, this bullet doesn't really apply to you. But if you're going through and just reading through for the content and the clarity, just try to read through the typos and we can come through that and conquer it again on the next read through. And so you want to read through these papers as you would any other academic paper. If you can't read at a normal speed, or you find yourself having to reread a paragraph more than once, assuming that you're really paying attention and not distracting or multitasking, that's an indication that it might be hard to read and understand. So just keep that in mind, that you should have to read through it about the speed that you would read through a textbook. And of course, that's different across people. So I outline here how to actually operate the comments in Microsoft Word, but since we're screen sharing here, I'm just going to go to an example proposal paper. This is a paper that will be sent out to you guys. It's already been de-identified, but here we see a proposal. And so I'm going to show you here how to operate the comments and use them. And keep in mind that everyone's Microsoft Word is different. If you have an Apple version of Word, it's going to look much different. If you have an older version of Word, it's going to look different still. And what I mean by different is the tabs might look different, but all the same tools are there, and they're all under the same categories. And so if you can't find it on your specific version of Word, literally just Google what your version of Word is and what you're trying to do. And it'll pretty much give you a picture without having to even go to a web page. So to leave the comments here, I'm going to go to the top and go under the Review tab, which is where my comments and track changes are. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read through the paper, and whenever I find a spot that needs a comment, I'll just use this as an example here. You're going to highlight the text that the comment is relevant to. Go up here and click New Comment, and it's essentially just going to give you the spot to leave the comment in. So let's say I might say, combine this with the previous paragraph. It is too short to be a paragraph on its own. That's actually something I could fix in a track change and just move it up to the upper paragraph for them, but this is just for the example of leaving a comment. Okay, after I'm done leaving the comment, I can just click outside the comment box, and the comment is now there. So when the author goes to look at this paper, they can click on the comment, it will highlight the associated text, and then they'll be able to read your comment. You'll see that I both in this comment pointed out what the issue is. This paragraph is too short, it's only one sentence, and I also made a suggestion, which was to combine it with the paragraph above. And so that's the general idea with comments. You need to leave them throughout the paper, and I'll get more into exactly how many we need to leave in a few minutes. These instructions will also be in a downloadable version in the module if you want to print these out and look at the pictures with the itemized instructions. So step one, comments. How many comments do I need to leave? That really depends on the paper. You're probably going to get one paper that needs more comments than the other, just based on what the writer's strengths and weaknesses are, and how many times they've worked on this paper. But more than likely, a thoughtful review of any of these papers is going to include at least 2 comments on every page. You might be pointing out an issue with clarity or a suggestion for their methods or something like that, but there shouldn't be 2 comments on their entire research proposal. That's just showing that you haven't really gone through and thought critically about how you can really help them improve the paper. So generally, there's going to be at least 2 comments on every page of the paper, and that's not counting the title page, of course, and the reference page. But for the pages that are full pages of text, could be anywhere from 2 to 8 probably. But there's no right answer to how many. It's going to completely depend on the paper. So the second step, if you're breaking this down into steps across comments and track changes, is now to go through, after you've read through the whole paper and left comments on the content and the clarity, is to go through and actually proofread the paper for grammatical issues, typos, formatting issues, APA style writing issues, and things of that nature. So what we're going to do before you read through it and start editing it is turn on track changes. But first, let's talk about some of the things that you might want to help point out and change. We're not pointing things out anymore. We're literally going to change these things for the author. So you might want to point out things with grammar, spelling, punctuation, if they have an incomplete sentence or a run-on sentence. If their paragraph is too short, like the example I just did with the comment, you can just backspace and move paragraphs together as you see fit. Another thing you might want to change is APA style formatting. Maybe their headers are not bolded or aligned the proper way. Maybe their in-text citation doesn't have the comma in the right place, or doesn't use parentheses like it should. Perhaps their writing style is inaccurate. Maybe they spell out a number when they should be typing the numerical number. So anything of that level. Anything else you see that you need to proofread, just go ahead and do it. Again, you're putting yourself in the perspective that you're proofreading a family member or close friend's paper for a course, and they have to get an A on this paper, and their teacher is a real stickler for grammar and things of that nature. If you make a correction that you think needs an explanation, then you can after you correct the track change, you can highlight it and then leave a comment and perhaps explain why you changed it. That's not required, but oftentimes if you just want the author to know what's going on and why you changed something, it's a very helpful thing to leave, because then they can learn from that change a little bit easier. So again, here I detail how to operate track changes in Word. This will be downloadable in the module. But in this lecture, I'm going to go ahead and go back to this example proposal and show you how to turn track changes on. And so you'll notice that I'm still under the Review tab. I was just here leaving comments, right? So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on track changes. And track changes in my version of Word is a button right here. And so I'm going to click the button. You see that it's a little darker now, and that means that the button is pushed down, which means track changes are on. If you click on the arrow there, that's nothing that you really need to worry about. Just click the button. Now you see the track changes are off since it isn't a darker gray. So again, make sure they're on. And then starting from the beginning of the paper, I mean literally starting with the running head, you want to go from the paper from beginning to end and proofread the paper, making any corrections that are needed. And so let's say, instead of leaving a comment here, I'm just going to go ahead and fix this for the author here. So my track changes are on. I'm going to just move this up with the previous paragraph. And so here I have it so it's only showing simple markup. It's not really showing all the all the markup. If I wanted to see what I was doing, I could go to all markup, and it's showing that I deleted the paragraph there. Either way, all you need to do is just make sure that track changes are on as you're going through the entire paper. That's what I'll be looking for when I'm reviewing this paper. So some other things you might want to fix in the paper. Here we have an extra space between paragraphs. If you notice, these two paragraphs only have a double space between them. It's the same spacing between the lines within paragraphs and the lines between paragraphs. Whereas here you see some extra space. That's not per APA style, but it's something that Microsoft Word often defaults to, and so it's just something that we need to fix. And so to fix this, I'm just going to go ahead and show you. I'm going to highlight both of these paragraphs, and I'm going to go, and I'm going to tell Microsoft Word to not add space in between paragraphs in the same style. Press OK, and it just moved them a little closer together. And that's in a track change somewhere. Okay, then I'm going to go through the rest of the paper. I might want to do the same thing here. Again, I'm going to fix issues with citations, typos, anything and everything that you could fix, going all the way through the paper until you get to the reference page. And so you should also help fix errors with references. If you see the capitalization is wrong, or they're missing the italices, or the indents aren't hanging, or perhaps the reference header is highlighted, it doesn't need bolded, it doesn't need to be bolded. Okay, anything, we're editing this paper all the way to the very last reference. So how many track changes do you need to leave? Again, that totally depends on the paper. Some of these papers might have been proofread by the authors pretty well before they submitted it, and they might only need a couple track changes on each page, whereas one paper may not be as developed or as well proofread that you have, then it might need 10 or 15 track changes on the page. So after you've gone through and left comments on the entire paper and proofread the paper and made edits to it and actually done the corrections for them with track changes on, you need to save these papers under a certain file name so that I can navigate my way through them when I'm starting to compile feedback and send it back to the author. And so all of these papers are going to be de-identified just by a number. So instead of the author's name on the title page, it's just going to say paper 3 or paper 6 or whatever. And so for each paper, you need to name the file, what the paper is, followed by revision and your initials, okay? And so you'll have two papers. They'll both have your initials on them. Those will be different paper numbers. They'll be like paper 5 revision MO, paper 6 revision MO. And then when you're done with both papers, you can attach them to the Canvas submission folder that's in there and put them in the same submission. So after you attach one, there's a button in Canvas, and you can opt to simply add another file, and that's all you have to do. These are going to be due by this Sunday. So things to remember, just to reiterate, make sure you leave both tracked changes and comments. Just leaving comments is not sufficient, and just leaving track changes is not sufficient. I need to see that you operated both of them in Microsoft Word, and that you went through that process on both papers. And also make sure your track changes are on when you make changes. Otherwise, you're going to have to start over. If I can't see the track changes on the document, then I can't tell that you've made edits, and you won't be able to get the points for it on the rubric right here. And so here is the rubric for these peer reviews. They're both worth 15 points each for a total of 30 points. And so for each paper, you get 5 points for leaving comments. Again, we want to leave comments on content, clarity, flow, effective and ethical research design. You get 5 points for leaving track changes and making edits for them. You get 1 point for just getting the file name correct. And then there's 4 points for thoughtful review. And so this is just points to show that you really went through this paper and picked up on as many things as you could. And so if there's a lot of obvious errors in the paper that you didn't pick up on track changes or leave a comment on, then we're going to lose points on this thoughtful review because it'll be obvious that you missed things that should have been apparent to you and were easy to fix, okay? But as long as you try your best on it, you'll get all the points for thoughtful review. We essentially just don't want to fake it and try to leave random track changes and comments. It's going to be really obvious to me and detrimental to the author when I send it back. Same criteria for the second peer review. Keep in mind, again, that you're not graded on the accuracy of your grammar corrections. If you correct it to so that it's still not accurate, you're not going to get points docked for that. But you should look up things and try to help your peer to the best of your ability. Again, you are graded on the correct usage and sufficient usage of track changes and comments. You're all graded on the file name, and again, you are graded on being thoughtful and helping them as much as you can without leaving out obvious errors and suggestions and things that needed to be corrected. Typically, I take forever on these papers, but really going through one of these papers thoughtfully should take you at least 45 minutes each paper. And considering that's the only thing you have to do this week, in addition to this 30-minute EdPuzzle, that's not too much to ask for the senior capstone. So that's it for this EdPuzzle. Make sure to check your Mercer email, not your Canvas message, for the 2 papers that I'll email to you. And please let me know if you have any questions as you're going through the process.